SEP Fanfic Readings presents What the Room Requires by Alydia Rackham.
Chapter 18. Hermione. The path ahead of me led straight. It didn't bend or wind or even get thin. The forest, dark and hazy, sat silently to either side of me. No light beckoned from its depths. No door appeared where there hadn't been one before. I couldn't see where the path ended, though. I just gritted my teeth and marched on, my feet rustling on the pine needles and leaves on the path. Then, the trees crowded in beside me. Light began to fail. I stretched my hands out in front of me, and my eyes widened, trying to see, trying not to trip. It went dark. I couldn't tell the difference between my eyes being shut and my eyes open. I kept walking, shuffling my feet. I felt trees hug very close to my shoulders. Or maybe they weren't trees. They felt like walls. My hands struck something cool, smooth, and wooden. It instantly gave way, and a hinge squeaked. Light cut my eyes. It wasn't bright light. It was gray and ghostly, but I jerked to a stop and blinked several times to let my eyes adjust. But when they did, I stopped moving. I stood inside something like a closet, my feet on a wooden floor, the door in front of me hanging partially ajar. And beyond that door was a stone room with a tall, arched ceiling filled with all sorts of strange odds and ends. A bookcase, a phonograph, bird cages, stacked chairs, candlesticks, globes, a string of bells, a model ship, a skull, a wolf hide, a rumpled tapestry lying on the floor just outside where I stood. The room of requirement. The room that appears when you need a place to hide something. I had found the door. I stepped forward. "Are you sure we're at Hogwarts?" came a rough, gravelly voice from somewhere outside. I clapped a hand over my mouth. "Course," came the feminine reply. "Where else would we be?" "Bloomin' storage closet," that gravelly voice muttered. Then something tipped over and crashed on the floor. "Please, Greyback," thrummed a calm, smooth, serpentine voice. "Let's not make a mess yet, shall we?" My muscles shook with vicious spasms on all the heat drained from my body. Greyback, the werewolf Death Eater. And I knew that woman's voice. Bellatrix Lestrange. And that last voice. I had never heard it before, but I knew who was speaking. I was too late. It was already happening. I was too late. A pair of eyes glittered at me from one corner of the shadowed room beyond. "What's that?" the owner of the eyes wondered, as if she was asking about a piece of silverware on a table setting. My heart hammered. "What is what?" a man asked. I heard that voice quite recently. Lucius Malfoy. "There's summat in that cabinet," Bellatrix said, and started toward me. For an instant I caught sight of her deranged hair, her slender form, wide-eyed face, and her black, hodgepodge wardrobe, before I whirled around to run. I slammed straight into the back of the closet. The thud rang through the whole room. My head spun. "Heavens," that distant, slithery voice commented. "Did we leave someone behind?" Malfoy asked. "I doubt it," Bellatrix muttered, and the door of the cabinet flew open, bashing against its outside wall. I spun around, trying to see straight after my collision, my heartbeat pounding into my fingertips. Bellatrix stood just outside, her wand held loosely in her limp wrist hand. Giving me a quizzical look, her expression turned to one of slight distaste and further perplexion. She glanced back at the shadows. "Luce," she called, then she put the tip of her wand under her chin. "What's this?" Lucius Malfoy, clad in all sweeping black, strode up to his sister-in-law, stood behind her shoulder, and canted his head at me. "Why, I believe it's Miss Granger." "Miss what?" Bellatrix glanced up at him. "Who's she?" "A mudblood," Lucius stated, his icy eyes gazing at me unblinkingly. "She's in Draco's class." Bellatrix shrugged. "I'll kill her." She leveled her wand at me. I screamed and threw myself backwards. "Bella, please calm down," the quiet voice urged. The murderous light in Bellatrix's eyes faded, and she glanced behind her. "My lord?" My entire frame turned to ice. "Bring her here, if you would," the tones requested. "I would like to see the little thing first." Bellatrix lashed out and grabbed me by the front of my collar and jerked me out of the cabinet. I stumbled out over the fallen tapestry, and my neck wrenched as Bellatrix dragged me forward, Malfoy striding just to my right. I had no strength to fight her, no capability of striking her. Not now that I'd heard that voice. Bellatrix threw me onto my knees. I crashed to the stones, catching myself with my hands, shivering so hard I thought I would be sick. I halfway lifted my head. In front of me, in a half circle, all robed in black, stood that grayback werewolf, and 4 more Death Eaters I did not recognize. They looked down at me with cold indifference and slight curiosity, as if I was the slightly boring pre-show to a halfway decent concert. Calm darkness breathed from their frames, like fog across the sea. They waited, saying nothing. Movement caught my eye, movement from behind them. A tall form glided by, pale-faced and elegant in movement. Night dripped from his shoulders, spread across his form, and cascaded silently around his feet. He lifted a long, white hand and barely touched one of the Death Eaters on the shoulder with his fingertips. The bearded man instantly turned and moved out of the way, bowing his head. The tall form swept into the space like a shadow and settled in front of me. I did not look into the face. For a long moment he just stood there, motionless. I could hear my heart pounding. I could hear the breathing of the Death Eaters. I sensed Bellatrix shift her right foot. The darkness of his cloak gathered and pooled around his feet. He bent down, and he knelt in front of me. With a graceful, soft hand, he reached out and put his finger under my chin. Agony lanced through my body, my breath locked in my chest. I could not move. I could do nothing but lift my face as he lifted his hand, forcing my eyes to meet his. His eyes. His eyes like a snake's, gold or red or both, gleaming like jewels, but hooded, penetrating, and human. Without light, without softness, but not without feeling, not without depth. Depth that waited to swallow me, or drive me underground. The slits of his nose flared for a moment, and he canted his white head. Delicate, pale lips lifted in quiet, nearly invisible smile. "Tell me, little one, before I let Bella kill you," he breathed, the undertones of his voice shaking my bones. "Where have you hidden Draco Malfoy?" Draco. I was cold. A deep unsettlement stirred inside me, making me shift and try to roll over. Something bound my limbs, pressed against my head, and sealed my eyelids. I took a deep breath and tried to say something. I only groaned through tight lips. I took another breath, twisted, and finally broke through the restraint. I opened my eyes. I let my breath out through my mouth. It fogged in a cloud of vapor. Frowning, I started to sit up. Ice cracked on the top of my blanket. Frost shrouded the brown grass all around me. The branches of the willow hung stiff and leafless, and beyond them, for I could see straight through the curtain, the barley stood still, gray and frozen. The second thought, I realized Hermione was gone. I leaped to my feet, flinging off my blanket, which was actually hers. She must have covered me with it when my eyes fell on the flower lying by my pillow. It was the remains of her daffodil, now withered and covered with frost. Fear plunged through my gut. I whirled around, searching the field beyond the curtain. "Hermione!" I called, my fist clenched. "Blast it, Granger, where did you go?" A light glimmered in the distance. I frowned. I couldn't see the forest, just a door-shaped light. My heart thudded. Had she found the door? And if she had, why hadn't she come to get me? I frowned deeply. No, something was wrong. I felt it in the chill air I breathed. I swallowed hard and stepped forward. I pushed the willow curtain out of the way. It crackled as it moved, and strode out into the frosty barley field. The ice-covered stalks rattled as I went. Ahead of me, a great wall of fog loomed. When the door-shaped light waited, it wasn't a very bright light, gray and thin, but I could see it well enough. I could hear nothing but my own steps until— "Luce," a woman's voice wondered. "What's this?" I jerked to a stop. I knew that voice. Aunt Bellatrix. Aunt Bellatrix! "Why," my father's velvet tones expressed mild surprise, "I believe it's Miss Granger." My heart leaped into my throat and terror crashed through my body. I tried to swallow, tried to move, but my muscles paralyzed. "Miss what?" Aunt Bellatrix asked. "Who's she?" "A mudblood," my father answered, and disdain colored his voice. "She's in Draco's class." Aunt Bellatrix remarked. "I'll kill her." Hermione screamed. I threw my hands up to cover my face. "Bella, please calm down." A quiet voice cut through. Slowly, my fingers lowered and closed around my throat. My lord, Aunt Bellatrix said, much subdued. All of my blood seemed to drain out of me. Bring her here, if you would, the tones commanded. I would like to see the little thing first. I moved forward. I moved before I knew what I was doing. I closed my fists and stepped on the hardened ground toward the sound of the voices of my aunt, my father, and the one who had branded his name on my skin. I slowed just a moment as I stood in the shadows and gazed out into the room beyond the frame of a narrow, tall door. There stood my father and Aunt Bellatrix, their backs to me. Between them knelt the shivering form of Hermione. In front of her bowed the Dark Lord, his hand beneath her chin, his fixed eyes on her. Behind him waited several more Death Eaters, like stone sentinels at a graveyard, and all of them stood within the crowded room of requirement, where I had always gone to mend the vanishing cabinet. Tell me, little one, before I let Bella kill you, the Dark Lord murmured, his lips forming a soft smile around sharp teeth. Where have you hidden Draco Malfoy? I put my right foot forward and rested my weight on it. I stepped forward with my left foot. I began walking. Right in front of me, that room held my whole world, my entire existence. And with every step I took, it crumbled away, and the shadow of death loomed higher. I kept walking. Hermione. I don't know what you are, I gasped, trying to force air into my strangled lungs. Voldemort. Voldemort clenched his jaw. His eyes flashed. He leaped back and backhanded the air. I flung onto my back. My skull bounced off the stones. Tears filled my eyes, and I clamped my hands into fists and stared up at the ceiling. My lips trembled, but I didn't make a sound. I thought I had been prepared to die, but he wasn't ready to kill me yet. Crucio. That 3 seconds of it, only 3, drove a shaft of black agony through me and my heels to the crown of my head. My voice rang through the room, banging on the walls like someone else was screaming. I went limp as the curse lifted off of me, as if someone had raised a fallen bookcase off my chest. Ask her again, Bella. Voldemort sighed. I heard him through a haze, saw him through a pounding blur. Bellatrix bent over me, black eyes burning. What have you done with Draco, Mudblood? She snarled in my face. He was to let us in tonight, but he wasn't here. We barely got in by the skin of our teeth. She grabbed the front of my shirt and pressed her nose against mine. He wasn't here, but you were. She shook me, striking my head back on the stones. Did you kill him? No, I choked, tears now running down my temples. Where is he, then? I don't know. Bellatrix raised up and pointed her wand at me again. Here I am. Bellatrix's head flew up. Every Death Eater's eye traveled past me, and I felt a slight vibration, heard a soft tapping as someone stepped out of the same cabinet I had and walked toward us. Bellatrix let go of me and stood up. I twisted my head, my shaking body too weak to turn over or get up. I saw familiar black shoes and trousers, a white short, pale hands, handsome face, shadowed blue eyes, and snow-white hair. Draco. Draco. I tried to move my mouth, to get my lips to work, but they would not obey. I wanted to stretch my hand out to him, to crawl to him, but my left hand only twitched in response. Draco, where have you been? Mr. Malfoy barked. Draco looked calmly at his father. Here, he replied. We didn't see you, Bellatrix countered. Draco just glanced at his aunt. A great shudder ran through me. Why didn't you have this with you? Mr. Malfoy asked through his teeth, stepping around my head to hold out a wand to his son. We found it on the floor as we came in. Draco stared at the wand a moment, then took it from his father, meeting his eyes for just an instant. Thank you, he said. Then he looked down at me. Our gazes locked. Neither of us breathed or spoke. You didn't answer your father's question, Voldemort reminded him, even quieter than before. Why weren't you here? And why didn't you have your wand? Draco lifted his white face to the Dark Lord, who waited, just as all the other Death Eaters did, watching him. I'll tell you later, Draco said. First, we can finish what you came for. Voldemort studied him for a moment, then let out a short, soft laugh. Interesting, he murmured. He wishes to distract us from the Mudblood girl. Draco blinked slowly, as if he had just been injected with a poison. The other Death Eaters muttered amongst themselves. Bellatrix narrowed her eyes at him. That is nonsense, Mr. Malfoy chuckled nervously. She obviously impeded him in performing his duties, but now he is here and we can move. It isn't nonsense, Malfoy. Voldemort gained an edge to his voice, and his smile vanished. Look at him. They all did. So did I. Draco did not move. He did not turn away from the Dark Lord. He held his wand loosely in his right hand. All he did was swallow. See? Voldemort smirked. He cares for her. Rubbish! Mr. Malfoy cried. Silence, Lucius! Voldemort thundered. Do you know your own son so little? Mr. Malfoy now turned terrified eyes to his boy. I almost felt a pang of sympathy for him. Voldemort stepped silently around me and stood by my left side, facing Draco, still 10 feet away from him. Draco did not shiver. He did not turn away. He gazed right up into the Dark Lord's eyes, his face blank. Slowly, Voldemort cocked his head. Are you planning to come with us, Draco? He asked. I will come with you, Draco replied, if you leave her alive. Voldemort's eyes flashed with something like amusement. No, he shook his head once. I'm going to kill her. Draco blinked once. Then I will fight you, he said. Draco! Mr. Malfoy gasped. If you do, you will die, and I will kill you only when you plead for death. Draco turned and met my eyes with his crystal blue ones, then gazed at his father, then lifted his face once more to the Dark Lord. Light entered his gaze, light unlike any his father had ever possessed, and his lip curled in an old defiance with a new purpose. He took a breath and spoke right to the Dark Lord, his voice calm and low. Do your worst. Draco, don't! I tried, my voice breaking. Shut up! Bellatrix reached down and ripped at my hair. I shrieked. Draco lashed out and kicked his aunt's shoulder with all his might. She toppled to the ground, screeching. I flung myself away from her. Lucius Malfoy cried his son's name. Voldemort moved. Green light exploded. Lucius howled in anguish. A body thudded to the ground right beside me. I flung myself on top of him. I clawed at his shirt. I wailed into the stones. Draco. I kicked my aunt as hard as I could, fury and fear blackening my vision. I heard my father scream my name in bone-breaking dread. Voldemort swept toward me, lifting his wand. I swung mine across my body, executing the most perfect Expelliarmus of my life. He blocked it. Avada Kedavra! Green light swallowed me. I had one instant more to gaze down into Hermione's pretty face. I'd never expected my life to end so quickly. I'd hoped to have more time to do something great, something earth-shattering with it. But I didn't have any more time. This was it. So what did I have to show for my 16 years? I had defied Lord Voldemort, and I'd let someone into my heart, and that was great and earth-shattering enough. Blackness took me. I fell. Heal what has been hurt, change the fate's design, save what has been lost, bring back what once was mine. The incantation from Tangled. Hermione. I lay on the stones, face down. All my muscles trembled. All around me was silence, and familiar warm light. Everyday light. Slowly I opened my eyes. An arm lay underneath my chest. My left arm stretched across the back of a pair of broad shoulders, shoulders that rose and fell. Warmth lay beside me. A pale face was turned towards mine. Draco's face. Eyes closed. I made my trembling hand move, run across the back of his shirt, and I pressed my fingertips to his face. It was warm. He opened his eyes. Blue, brilliant, vivid, living eyes gazed back into mine. My heart shuddered. Draco? I whispered. He blinked, then slowly moved his arms and pushed off the stones. He sat up. I came up with him, unable to breathe, unable to keep my eyes from him. We stared at each other as we sat on the floor. I stretched out my hands and cradled his face. I couldn't speak. He glanced to his right. After an instant, I glanced there too. There stood a great door, hanging open. Beyond it was a completely empty, dimly lit stone room. Then, as we watched, the great, dark door swung closed. It shut with a firm, deep thud that shook the floor. And then, like a drawing being erased, it melted into the stone of the wall. Like we were made of stone ourselves, we turned our heads the other way and gazed up the wide, empty Hogwarts corridor. In the distance, we heard people laughing and talking and walking. A torch happily flickered on the wall near us. I took a deep breath. I smelled food and parchment and castle mustiness. It all smelled and felt more real than anything had in ages. I turned and stared at the wall. It had been a nightmare. All of that with the Death Eaters and Voldemort. It hadn't happened yet. We had made it out before they came. We had made it out. Out of the horror and agony and blood, out of the willow and the barley field and the sunlight. I turned back to Draco, desperately searching his face. Did he remember everything? Had he truly been there with me all this time? My hand still held his face, and a single tear fell from his eye down across my thumb. That was all the answer I needed. Come on, I gasped, heart fluttering, swiping at my own face and then reaching down to grab his hand. I saw my wand laying on the floor, right there, and I snatched it up. Then I clambered up and pulled Draco to his feet. Come on, come on! He stopped, pulled back, but gripped my hands hard, still holding his wand in his right hand. He wouldn't look at me. He stared at the ground. Draco, I whispered earnestly, stepping closer to him and looking straight at him. Trust me. He blinked. More tears tumbled. He glanced around, then his brow tightened as he looked down at me. Trust me, I breathed again, and this time, when I tugged on him, he came right with me, and hand in hand we raced down the hallway.